and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 142, an interview with Douglas Waller, author of the recently released Disciples, the World War II missions of the CIA directors who fought for Wild Bill Donovan, published by Simon & Schuster. So thank you very much, Mr. Waller, for being with us.
Well, it's good to be here.
I really do appreciate it. I really enjoyed the perspective this book has brought to, as much as I've read, I really did enjoy this different window into this world, so I just really enjoyed it a lot. So if I could get some of the background and information out of the way, just to give everybody an idea of where you're coming from. Mr. Waller is a veteran correspondent, author, and lecturer. In almost 2 decades as a Washington correspondent, he covered the Pentagon, Congress, the State Department, the White House, and the CIA. From 1994 to 2007, Mr. Waller served in Time Magazine's Washington Bureau, eventually as a senior correspondent. At Time Magazine, Mr. Waller covered foreign affairs extensively as a diplomatic correspondent, traveling throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, as well as the Persian Gulf region. In the past, he has reported extensively on the Middle East peace negotiations and the wars in Iraq. He came to Time Magazine in 1994 from Newsweek, where he reported on major military conflicts, from the Gulf War to Somalia to Haiti, and has authored or co-authored some 9 books.
Yeah, it's a total of 9 books.
Wow, that's amazing. And I just have to tell you, my favorite one before I read Disciples was A Question of Loyalty, General Billy Mitchell and the Court-Martial That Gripped the Nation. Another one that you did, I think this came out this was the one that came out before Disciples, was Wild Bill Donovan, the spy master who created the OSS and modern American espionage. And that one came out in 2011. So I guess this is just the next step. The Disciples was the next step after the Wild Bill Donovan book.
Well, it was. I actually, after I finished Wild Bill Donovan, I was really hunting around for another subject. This was about 4 years ago.
Right.
Because Donovan was really a hard act to follow. I mean, you're talking about a larger-than-life figure here.
Right.
Someone who was awarded the Medal of Honor in World War I for heroism on the battlefield, a millionaire Wall Street Republican lawyer, and the man that Franklin Roosevelt picked to be his top spy master in World War II. So I was trying to find some group character or group of characters that were as intriguing, complicated, and multifaceted as Donovan was. And then I finally settled on Disciples and basically an ensemble biography of 4 characters.
Right. Well, I think the 4 men from this book did you justice as far as trying to find something as fascinating as Donovan, because as much as I just read his exploits and I kept going, oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. I mean, this man was just a dynamo, and at the end of the day, he didn't get what he wanted, I guess, to run the CIA, but his protégés, if you will, or his lieutenants, did get that honor, and they had, good and bad times at the CIA.
Well, that's true. I mean, Disciples is about 4 men who served as operatives for Donovan in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, during World War II. And this was Allen Dulles, Richard Helms, William Colby, and William Casey. All 4 later became or were among the most controversial directors the Central Intelligence Agency has ever had.
Well, if I can go back to something just for a second, I really enjoyed the Billy Mitchell story, and for my membership episode, a different series, I covered him a little bit in a couple series, a couple episodes, and it was just amazing to me, and it's a good reminder that people are fearful of change. I mean, here's this guy going, yeah, you can spend all this money and build these huge battleships and make them even bigger and have these huge guns, but you give me a couple of planes with some bombs at the fraction of the cost, fraction of the size, and the fraction of the time it takes to make this big battleship, and I can send that thing to the bottom of the ocean. I mean, I can see why the establishment was nervous about him, but at the end of the day, he was right in the message he was trying to, bring to help save his country.
Well, that is true. I mean, Billy Mitchell was another kind of multifaceted, very controversial character, and I enjoyed doing the biography of him. Mm-hmm. Again, he had been an air hero in World War I, and in the 1920s, he gained international fame, proving that small, rickety biplanes could sink a battleship. He was also extremely controversial. People either loved him or hated him, and he was eventually put on trial in Washington for insubordination. He accused Calvin Coolidge of being criminal in his neglect of air power. Right. Of course, no president could put up with something like that. And so after I finished Mitchell, I thought, okay, I kind of gravitate to controversial characters, right. And that certainly was Wild Bill Donovan. I mean, he had political enemies in Washington, a lot of them, as a matter of fact, who thought he was as big a threat to the United States as Adolf Hitler was in Europe. His agents, on the other hand, revered him as a charismatic leader.
Right, yeah. And maybe, I don't know, there's only... people like that are just so fascinating, and you're right, they do create either intense loyalty or intense hatred. And as we're going to see when FDR passes away and he is replaced, because he was a good friend of FDR. Donovan was a good friend of FDR, and so that shield, that umbrella, wasn't there anymore. And you've got to be thinking, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to this man and his institution now? But obviously, we can get into that later. I just have to say, not only did I bought your book, but I also bought the Audible version, and for this entire week going to and from work, listened to it, and it just made my really long commute absolutely enjoyable. I would pull up into my driveway going, no, I'm already home. So I think, and again, this is my way of just saying thank you. One of the things that my podcast tries to do is, as I try to bring as much detail as I can. I'm not a famous researcher or anything like that, but I find as many books as I can. And I just have to say, this story of these four men, as much as you kept the story moving, as fascinating as it was, it just drips with details, and you were able to pull in all these asides and give it references and give it context, and it made things make sense. It okay, now I get why that happened, and this happened because of this. And so again, I just want to thank you, because it was just a sheer pleasure to read and then listen to this.
Well, I'm glad it made your commute shorter.
If you can do that for someone, you're truly blessing their life, if only for a couple of days. So I just wanted to say thank you. Mm-hmm. Since we're going to be talking about Wild Bill Donovan's lieutenants, as it were, if you could just give us just a short background on him and kind of the creation of the OSS, I think that'd give this entire story some context. And I realize this single question can take you 2 or 3 hours, but if you could just give us a basic background, I think that would help bring all the other questions into focus.
Sure. By way of background, in July 1941, Roosevelt signed an executive order, just a one-page, vaguely worded document, mm-hmm. that designated General, at that time it was Colonel William Wild Bill Donovan, to be his coordinator of information. Later, his organization would be called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Mm-hmm. And basically, the document, which left the rest of Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet scratching their heads and wondering what in the world has he done, said that Colonel Donovan would collect information of national security importance for us and do other odd jobs. Donovan liked to say that he began his spy agency really from -0, which was really the case. He only began with one guy, and that was himself. Over the course of the war, however, he built a shadow force of more than 10,000 espionage agents, saboteurs, commandos, research analysts, propagandists, and support personnel scattered in stations overseas all over the globe. Fairly remarkable achievement, considering, as I say, he only started out with Wild Bill Donovan. My last biography, of course, was of Donovan and how he shaped this organization and led it in a very, very chaotic and obviously wartime environment.
Right.
This book, Disciples, then takes the story further and recounts the four men who worked under Donovan, who later became CIA directors. All of them were operatives in the OSS, which was the precursor to today's modern CIA.
And I guess it makes sense if you think about it, but FDR has signed the Lend-Lease. We're going to be, obviously taking the side of the Allies. We're going to be supplying them, but yet the American military, which I think you said in your book, was ranked 17th behind Romania, which staggers me, which pretty much shows how much America had cut back after World War I. We didn't know hardly anything except for what was in the newspapers. Roosevelt, the military, and everybody's going, okay, we need some intel before we really get involved in this. And the day is coming for us to get involved. What are we going to do? And I guess the OSS was Roosevelt and Donovan's answer to that question.
Well, and it's interesting that Roosevelt did pick Donovan, because keep in mind, Donovan at that point was a prominent Wall Street Republican lawyer, often mentioned as a Republican presidential contender in the future. Wow. And Roosevelt brought him into his administration. Right. But Donovan was part of the internationalist wing of the Republican Party. He believed, like Roosevelt, that America did need to build up its defenses. It did need to prepare itself for war. Roosevelt, at that point, we're talking in the summer of 1940, actually toward the end of 1940, going into 1941, had no foreign intelligence service to speak of. There were small foreign intelligence units in the Army and the Navy, but they were largely dumping grounds for poor-performing officers. Roosevelt was making at this point, this is in 1940, major foreign policy decisions, not the least of which was Lend-Lease aid for the British. And he was making a lot of these major decisions, how to align with Churchill, largely blind to what lay ahead of him overseas. In fact, he worried so much about what he didn't know overseas that at times it would make him physically ill.
So Wild Bill Donovan, he's a Republican, but at the same time, at least he and the president agree, we need to get into this thing. We need to get ready, at the very least, to protect American interests, if not to make sure the right side wins the war. Besides that having that same thought, were these two gentlemen friends? Did they know each other before the war, or?
Well, they knew each other, but the relationship was complicated. Right. Donovan, relationships were always complicated. But in the case of Roosevelt, even more so, because in 1932, Donovan ran for governor of New York. He ran against a guy named Herbert Lehman, who had been Roosevelt's lieutenant governor when Roosevelt was governor of New York. And, of course, 32 is the first year that Roosevelt runs for president. Right. Donovan, on the campaign trail, ended up saying as many bad things about Roosevelt as he did about Herbert Lehman. At one point, he accused Roosevelt of being, quote, crafty. Another time he accused him of being a, quote, Hyde Park faker, because Roosevelt claimed he was just a simple farmer from Hyde Park, and Donovan thought that was a bunch of baloney. Now, in today's political culture, that's pretty lukewarm, toast to say the least. Back then, those were fighting words, and Roosevelt fired back by having surrogates go out on the campaign trail. Even Eleanor Roosevelt went out on the campaign trail to trash Donovan. So here you have two guys who were at odds, at loggerheads in New York politics. They were on opposite sides, but we have two very canny politicians who see common cause in one another and see how both of them could be useful to the other. Roosevelt was never personally close with Donovan, and Donovan didn't really want to be personally close with Roosevelt. He always thought it was kind of like a moth to the flame type of situation. If you got too close, you might get burned up. But they both saw advantage into forming this actually unusual alliance.
Well, yeah, and the good thing for all of us is that it worked out. Before we jump into the four main characters, I couldn't help but think, because I'm not a young man anymore, if I was a 21-year-old guy walking into the bookstore and I saw your book, oh, look, Spies, that's cool, and I picked it up and bought it and started reading it, the way you start out is you give the background for these four individuals and even kind of the stories of their families in general. You've got to be thinking some 21-year-old person would be going, oh my goodness, was this another planet? I mean, the pace of life, the role of men to women, and certainly what was expected of women. I mean, this is obviously way before the internet. It's before World War II. And it's just had to, I would think that if I was 21, I'd be like, I can't even really understand. I can't relate in general to just the pace of life and the idea of courting a female. I mean, those are institutions that are just gone. And hopefully they would just be able to appreciate what once was considered the proper and normal way to do things, the way to carry out your life.
Well, that's true. And these four characters, Dulles, Helms, Colby, and Casey, came from different walks of life. Mm-hmm. Alan Dulles, born in the 1890s, was basically born into diplomatic nobility. His grandfather on his mother's side and his uncle on his mother's side were secretaries of state. Richard Helms was his grandfather was a very famous international banker. His father was an Alcoa executive who, along with his mother, suffered bouts of depression. Bill Colby, who was born in 1920, was an Army brat. His father was rose to the rank of colonel in the Army, was something of a curmudgeon, not a particularly pleasant fellow to be around. Colby traveled from, the family moved from one duty station to the next, which was an education in itself for him. Right. Bill Casey came from, a working class New York background. His father was a Tammany Hall bureaucrat. He went to Fordham University, the first in his family to go to college. Eventually went to Catholic University of America in Washington. Thought he was going to be a social worker, but after several months as a social worker in New York, decided he hated the job. Thought the money was being wasted, and Franklin Roosevelt was a bleeding heart liberal.
Right.
But for all the different backgrounds of these four men, I found a common thread that ran between them. Mm-hmm. Principally that they were all smart. In fact, you could say they were intellectuals in the sense that they were voracious readers. They were insatiably curious, and they were creatures of reason. But these weren't the ivory tower types, who'd sit for hours in doubtful introspection. Right. These were men of action. These were doers, supremely confident men who believed that they could shape history rather than let it control them.
That's a pretty high level of confidence. I don't think I've ever felt that in my life, but and just one more thing before we jump into this. So you've got these men of action. They're very intelligent. They've read a lot. And most of them, not all of them, have started out life pretty well based on the fortunes or careers of those who came before them. But it just struck me, and maybe it shouldn't, I don't know. If you open a newspaper today or get online, this couple is divorcing after 6 months of marriage. This couple is divorcing after 19 years of marriage. This politician has to step down because he or she has just been found they've been having an affair. And I don't know if there's a definitive answer for this, but most of these men were having affairs. There seemed to be a lot of affairs going around. And I just wonder, is it just because they're alpha males, or is it the mentality I'm far away from home, or I'm in a war zone, I could die, let me, carpe diem, let me seize the day. I was just struck, and it's probably because of my very simple life, living kind of out in the middle of nowhere the way I do, but it just struck me that everybody was just... I don't know. Everybody had an affair. Almost everybody was having affairs, and I think it was Dulles he had an affair with one lady who was a secretary. She was hit upon by another spy, and he said, "Yeah, go ahead because you can get some more information." I mean, just that mentality is just so alien to me when it comes to, I don't know. They love their wives, but then they did all these things, and they were okay with it inside their own heads.
Well, it's true. I mean, Donovan had a number of mistresses, which was common knowledge in Washington, particularly in military and FBI circles, and it even got to the White House. Allen Dulles had a number of mistresses, too. And when he set up his OSS station in Bern, Switzerland, he recruited a lot of several Americans there to serve on his staff, one of whom was Mary Bancroft, who was an American socialite living in Switzerland, who also became Dulles's mistress. Right. Interestingly, Dulles's wife never much appreciated the mistresses that Dulles had, right. Although she became close friends with Mary Bancroft eventually. Go figure. Now, our other three characters here, Bill Casey was utterly devoted to his wife Sophia, right. Throughout, and it's really a love story there that I portray in the book. Mm-hmm. William Colby married a stunning, beautiful woman. She looked like Barbara Stanwyck, 1940s, just gorgeous. Mm-hmm. But they grew apart over the years, particularly when he was at the CIA and director and afterwards, and eventually they divorced. Richard Helms, likewise, married a very wealthy socialite in Indianapolis, mm-hmm. and eventually over the years, they grew apart too. And after, when he was leading the CIA and the Johnson administration, Helms asked his wife for a divorce as well. Being the wife of a CIA officer or an OSS officer is a pretty tough job because you are walled out of your spouse's life. He cannot talk about, he or she actually, it can be either way, right. Can't talk about what they do for a living. They go away for long periods and come back. And your circle of friends tends to get narrowed very often to other CIA officers and their wives because they're the only people you can socialize with and talk openly because they're the only ones that have the security clearances. Yeah. So it can be real tough on marriages, not only back then but even today too.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I can come home and say, oh, I had such a horrible day, and I can talk about it, and my wife can share my angst or whatever, and it's just one of those many things you can bond over. These guys and the women, they could not talk about it, and it's just this, I guess it's just this thing that just grows within you. You just as much as you love each other, you just grow further and further apart. A CIA officer that comes home, says, "Oh well, honey, what did you do at the office today?" He can't go say, "Well, I overthrew your government in Djibouti today," or something like that. Yeah, had a really great day. Had a really bad day. I just can't tell you anything. Yeah. So let's just jump into this. So Hitlerism has run all over Europe. We've got to do something. So I guess really the only bastion or the only safe place really in Europe is Switzerland. And so I guess Donovan. Now, did Dulles want to do that? Did Donovan pick Dulles to go to Bern, or was it his background that made him a strong candidate for that role to go there and to start gathering intelligence?
Dulles actually lobbied to go to Bern, Switzerland. Okay. By way of background, he had Dulles in 1916 joined the State Department and served in Bern, Switzerland during World War I with the American legation there, and by default became the legation's de facto intelligence officer. There just wasn't anybody else to do the job. Right. Switzerland during World War I and also during World War II was a spy haven. All the warring powers had espionage agents there in the city. In November 1942, just after the Allies' torch invasion of North Africa, mm-hmm. Dulles slipped into neutral Switzerland to set up the OSS station there. His mission from Donovan was to penetrate Nazi Germany, and it was a good perch to do it there because Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, was surrounded by Germany or German-occupied countries, France, Italy, Germany, and those three.
Right.
So Dulles immediately set up what amounted to a mini CIA in Bern, Switzerland, running espionage operations against the Germans, funding guerrilla groups and resistance groups in occupied France and Italy, hatching propaganda schemes against the Nazis, and flooding Washington with cables with foreign policy advice on how to deal with the Axis. Most of those cables unsolicited by Washington, by a matter of fact.
I couldn't help but thinking, okay, so as the OSS gets going, it gets established, and there's different sources of information coming in. I mean, all this is coming back to Donovan. Obviously this is before computers. I mean, he must have been getting tons of information. I mean, how do you collate that? How do you organize it? How do you realize what's connected? I mean, I guess they were just doing it with a whole bunch of paper and pencil and cards, but I imagine that Donovan had the ability to just stick a lot of it in his mind and just work that way. I mean,
well, the information, particularly sticking with Dulles for the moment, he filed it in cables, had roundabout routes to take larger quantities of information that they had to practically go all over to Europe before it got to the London station and to Washington. He eventually was able to establish a phone line to have direct radio telephone contact with Washington, although the Swiss intelligence service was able to listen into it, and Dulles always assumed that the Germans were too, so he could only talk about unclassified matters. But it was a fairly a crude operation back then. Keep in mind too that when Dulles went to Switzerland in November 1942, he didn't have time to spend years setting up, an elaborate undercover espionage operation against Germany. He had to hit the floor running when he arrived there, and with Donovan's consent, he basically hung a shingle outside of his apartment and said, snitches and informants and spies, welcome, come on in. Well, a lot of them did, and he had a lot of informants that walked into the door. A lot of them turned out to be professional snitches who would sell the same secret to the Germans in the morning, to the British in the afternoon, and then to Dulles in the evening. But Dulles met them all, and salted among those groups were some Abwehr and Nazi agents, some Russian intelligence agents trying to figure out what Dulles was doing there. So, and out of that, though, he managed to develop some very prized agents that we can talk about. But he had a batting average in the beginning that after a year, Donovan's had his senior officer send Dulles a note that most all of the intelligence he was sending in, the War Department was discounting because a lot of it turned out to be inaccurate. It improved dramatically over the years, but it was a bumpy start.
And was he able to improve? I guess they gave him a warning or chided him or whatever, but I guess he's able to get better in time. You kind of learn as you go. But like you said, they don't have a lot of time because everybody's going to assume at some point the Americans have to get on the continent, the Allies have to get on the continent, and we need to know a lot of things. We need to disrupt the Germans. So does Dulles get better, one, by just kind of learning the ropes, but two, I guess he gets access to some really good sources that gives him, accurate insights into Nazi Germany at the time.
Well, he did, he developed some prized sources. One of them was a man named Fritz Kolbe, who was a short, bald guy with, beady eyes and big ears, who was a diplomat in the German Foreign Office, right. Who approached the American legation in Switzerland and offered to be a spy for Dulles. The British had rejected Kolbe, thought he was a double agent, but Dulles saw value in it. And eventually Kolbe delivered to Dulles something on the order of 1,000 secret Nazi diplomatic, military, and intelligence cables. When he first arrived in Bern, he had the secret documents literally tied around his leg underneath his pants with a cord. Dulles eventually gave him a miniature camera to photograph the material and deliver it, the microfilm, to him in a watch case. Another prized source of Dulles's was a man named Hans Baron Gisevius, who was a stern Abwehr major who detested Adolf Hitler and who kept fed Dulles information about the German dissident movement that remained inside Germany that was plotting the assassination of Adolf Hitler in what became the failed Valkyrie plot on July 20th, 1944. You remember Tom Cruise did a movie.
Oh, yeah. And I'm sorry.
One other thing on Gisevius, he was a hulk of a man, huge guy, over 6 feet tall, and Dulles gave him the code name Tiny.
Everybody's got to have a code name. Every location's got to have a code name. Wow, just keeping all that straight would confuse me. But so I guess eventually he's able to get some really good sources. He's able to get insights. I mean, but it would be almost too easy, too convenient, or whatever, if the Germans were able to bump off Hitler themselves. Yeah, you're a dictator, and so you're going to make a lot of enemies. But obviously Hitler through the SS, had security pretty much tightened down, so you can have all this information. You can know that there are people that hate Hitler, but obviously it takes years before there's a even close to being successful attempt to take this man out, which everybody is hoping would end the war, or at least unravel the Nazis' will to continue with the war.
Well, and keep in mind, too, the Roosevelt administration, Donovan, OSS headquarters back in Washington, and even Dulles and Bern were always leery of the information Major Gisevius was bringing back about the German dissident movement that remained there. You know, were they double agents? Was this a plot to trap Dulles? Right. And it was a chaotic situation that Dulles was dealing with then, mainly because he was getting flooded with peace feelers from Germany. They literally lined up at his door. Some of them came from representatives of Himmler, who could see that the course of the war was going against the Nazis and wanted to save his skin. So he was having envoys send peace feelers to Dulles too.
Wow. But yeah, I imagine anything coming from Himmler would be distrusted, even though he's not doing the right thing for the right reason. Like you said, he's trying to save himself. But I imagine they were leery of Himmler, to say the least. Tell me a little bit about Bill Casey in London. He's not the number one guy there. He's working for a man named Donald.
Well, yeah. By way of background, Bill Casey, when the war started, was working for, when the United States got involved in the war, was working for a research outfit, the Research Institute of America, which churned out analytical reports to help businesses land contracts with Roosevelt's New Deal. He wanted in on the action. At that point, he was married, had a baby girl. He finally talked the Navy into making him a lieutenant junior grade. And I say he talked him into it because it took some convincing with the Navy, because he had kind of a slovenly appearance. He made a bad first impression on everybody, and they didn't think he was officer material. But they found a spot for him in the service's ship buying program. Well, after a number of months pushing paper for the Navy, Casey was bored and wanted more action. Heard of this nefarious organization that Donovan had formed, that a lot of wealthy guys had joined up with. So he managed to wangle an interview with Donovan's recruiters, and they too weren't particularly impressed with him because he didn't seem to have much military bearing. But they decided to hire him, and Casey turned out to be a whiz at administration. He could also, from his Research Institute of America days, he had a skill for absorbing huge amounts of information and churning out very clear intelligence reports on him. So they packed him off to the OSS's very important London station at Grosvenor Square with the orders to oversee the flow of paperwork there, to set up a secretariat for David K.E. Bruce, who's the London station's chief.
Right.
In short order, Casey had his hands in every major operation the London station was running in Europe. He was like a human tornado. In fact, one of the officers there said of Casey that you could not pay attention to him. He got into everything. In December 1944, Donovan, who noticed this 31-year-old Navy lieutenant who seemed to be just as busy as anything and was impressed with him, Donovan made Casey his chief of secret intelligence for all of Europe, with the principal mission to infiltrate OSS agents into Nazi Germany.
Right.
Now, that was a daunting mission at that point. I mean, even though by then Germany was losing the war, it still remained one of the most ruthlessly controlled, efficient police states in the world. I mean, the average German citizen then had to carry up to 18 different basic identity documents, which a secret unit, Casey's under Casey's command, codenamed Bach, had to learn how to fabricate. So he really had to scramble to get agents into Nazi Germany. He eventually managed to parachute 150 agents into Germany, who some of them were able to radio back intelligence to the advancing armies, Allied armies going into the Third Reich.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, you can be Wild Bill Donovan and you can be charismatic and charm someone and get them to give you their all. But at the end of the day, you do need an efficient paper pusher, organizer, human computer, whatever. I mean, someone's got to make sense of all the intel that's coming in. And it sounds like that's what Casey's gift was. Besides having that tremendous amount of energy, you have to have someone make sense of everything that's coming in.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because Casey was really, I mean, you're talking 31 years old when he was made chief of secret intelligence for all of Europe. And there's some people thought that was maybe a little too young, including Alan Dulles. But as I say, Casey, eventually had something on the order of 330 people working for him in this operation. Now, everything didn't go smoothly. He had a batting average. Only about half of the some 105 missions that he sent into Germany were ever able to produce anything. First off, they were parachuted in the last 5 months of the war when things were pretty chaotic in Germany. A lot of them kept on getting overrun by the Allied forces. In fact, one of Casey's operatives complained at one point that General George Patton's Third Army was screwing up all his operations because they were overrunning his agents. A lot of the agents had to operate on the fly when they were in Germany. For example, there was one two-man team, codenamed Chauffeur, that was able to enlist the help of two French women forced to work in a Bavarian brothel. And while the women serviced their Wehrmacht clients, one of the agents hid in the closet with a flashlight and a notepad taking notes on what he blurted out.
Wow, that's one of the most awkward jobs of World War II. And I guess almost the opposite of Bill Casey maybe would be Colby. I mean, this guy just seemed like he was with the Jedburghs. I'm going to get you to explain all that. But, I mean, here's a guy who truly a man of action, and with the training and implementation of what they were about to do. I mean, I just really enjoyed his part of the story. And I can't help but say this. I mean, when they first get to the school, the Jedburgh school, the Americans' attitude about everything, about the establishment, about rank, and about keeping everything secret. I mean, the Americans just come in there and they're just like, let's just cut it out. We're ready to go, and let's just do this. And, of course, they weren't ready. They needed to be trained. But I just can't help but appreciate and chuckle at the overconfidence of all the Americans who were just ready to go in there and, quote, unquote, end the war for the British. You just got to love that pluckiness.
And by way of background, Colby, who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and become an Army officer, eventually was commissioned an ROTC second lieutenant in August 1941 when he turned the age of 21. Colby had a favorite line of Napoleon's that he really liked. It was Napoleon's standing order to his troops, which was march to the sound of the guns. In Colby's case, however, after he got into the Army, he seemed to be marching in the opposite direction, farther and farther away from the sound of the guns. He was initially stuck at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a pretty desolate post back then, teaching students how to fire howitzers. He eventually managed to get into training for the airborne artillery, but bad luck struck and he broke his ankle on one of the early jumps and was delayed in getting into an airborne artillery unit, was stuck at a replacement pool in Camp McCall, North Carolina, when in October 1943, he noticed there was a notice tacked to a bulletin board from some obscure organization called the OSS that he'd never heard of, that said if you were an airborne paratrooper and you spoke French, and Colby spoke French, and you're looking for adventure, call this number. Well, Colby called that number, and within a month, he was at the Congressional Country Club in Washington, D.C., which Donovan's agency had taken over to train spies and saboteurs. He was training there for a highly secret program codenamed Jedburgh that planned to drop three-man teams into occupied France just after D-Day to organize French resistance attacks against the Nazis. Eventually, after that training and training in the Catoctin Mountains near Roosevelt's presidential retreat, which is now called Camp David, Colby and the other OSS officers, the Jedburgh officers, shipped out to England and were sent up to Peterborough, north of London, to a country estate called Milton Hall, where the British continued the training of what became an international team of British, American, and mainly French officers that would be dropped into occupied France. He experienced somewhat of a culture clash there. He and the other American officers, a culture clash with the British. For example, all the American officers, OSS officers, had to learn the British way of parachuting. The British commandos jumped out of planes at altitudes as low as 500 feet. And their parachutes didn't come with a spare in case the first one failed, because at that low an altitude, you didn't have time to pull a spare anyway. Well, the instructors all told the Americans that, well, if your chute doesn't open, bring it back and we'll issue a new one. Of course, the Americans didn't find that joke particularly funny.
Oh my god! But so I guess the plan. So that was pretty. There's no comeback for that. But anyway, so I guess they're going to parachute in. They're going to gather information, gather intelligence, and stay ahead of the advancing Allies. And I think it was General Patton who. I'm not sure if I should be surprised by this or not, because you would think that here's this very stern man, but he was like, I don't care what idea, how kooky it sounds, if it works, if it helps me, advance towards Berlin, I'm going to take it. So he was willing, more than willing, to use this innovative way of gathering information to help his advance and, quite frankly, help his career. But he wanted to just march towards Berlin, and he took these guys in, and he was able to get some use out of them.
Well, yeah, Patton was amenable to Donovan's OSS force. And in fact, he and Donovan were old pals from there. They both owned nice country estates just outside of Washington in Virginia's horse country. Colby, finally, his mission, he finally dropped into the Burgundy region southeast of Paris in August 1944. with the mission of organizing the French resistance there to launch attacks in advance of Patton's Third Army as it approached. This was a complicated mission for Colby. You have the movie portrayals of the good wars of commandos and resistance fighters fighting the Nazis and everything. Right. Wasn't really the case for the Jedburgh commandos who dropped in. In Colby's case, he had to deal with a lot of different French resistance factions who were often poorly trained, poorly equipped, had their own separate private political agendas, and very often spent as much time squabbling among themselves as they did fighting the Nazis. He also, although he didn't know it at the time, was one of the leading French resistance leaders that he was dealing with, a man named Roger Bardet, turned out to be a traitor. He had been recruited and was collaborating with the German Abwehr. In fact, the Abwehr's top spy catcher, or one of its top spy catchers in France, a man named Hugo Bleicher, had recruited Bardet to feed him information and betray his country. So this was a difficult, complicated operation that Colby ran there. Very, very intense for him. He said that he was there several months, and it was the most intense several months of his life.
If I can read something from your book, you wrote a total of 523 OSS Special Operation Agents, Jedburghs, and other commandos fought behind the lines in France. 86 of them were killed, wounded, captured, or went missing. And the Britain had their own special operations executive. They sent in 480 agents, and 106 of them died in combat or were executed by the Nazis. So again, you've got this very complex situation going on. You really don't know if you can trust the French resistance and person in front of you, because are they loyal? Have they been turned by the Nazis? Maybe the Nazis have their relatives held somewhere, and they were probably just trying to survive, and two, trying to give Patton what he needed, because besides intelligence, you've got acts of sabotage going on. But I think I read at some point that Patton's army at some point, like you said, was moving so fast they were overrunning some of their own operations, and Patton's attitude must have been, "Well, stay ahead of me because I'm moving and I'm not going to stop." But again, just a very dangerous time, and these people. And it's not like there's a book for this that you can read. It's not like this has been done for the last 50 years. They were kind of making it up on the fly, and you didn't know who you could trust.
Well, and in the case of Patton, the way he used the French resistance and Colby's teams and other teams as he plowed through France was basically to watch out for his right flank as he headed north, in case the Germans attacked that right flank. Right. Now, Patton had a very famous line. He said, "Let the other son of a bitch worry about his flanks. I'm not going to. I'm moving ahead." Well, he could say that because the signal intercepts that the British had of the German military radio traffic told him that the Germans were interested in getting out of France at that point and weren't going to attack his right flank. So he was more than content to let teams like Colby's organize resistance movements along his right flank to protect it. So that's the function they serve there. Now, after Patton's force went through the Burgundy region, Colby's mission was over. His next assignment was leading a group of 32 Norwegian-American commandos to parachute into frigid Norway in March 1945. Their mission was to impede or help prevent the some 300,000 German occupiers in Norway from moving south and going back to Germany to fight the Allied advance. It was, again, this was a very difficult mission for Colby. He ended up, when they parachuted in March 1945, he ended up fighting Norway's brutal winter weather as much as he did the Germans. Right. Half of his force never even made it into Norway. The planes carrying them either got lost and couldn't find the drop zone in the snow, or they crash landed. Colby did manage to blow up a key bridge and section of railroad track on the Nordland rail line, which was carrying German troops through central Norway from north to south. But these were very risky operations, and the skiing they had to do was absolutely exhausting. In fact, Colby's team nicknamed one mountain they had to ski over Benzedrine Hill, because practically all of them had to pop the stimulants pills in their mouths to get the artificial energy to get up to its peak.
Wow, and I can't remember if it's during that or maybe right before it. And it's just a small part of your book, but it really stuck with me. You were talking about the emotional and physical stress on the Jedburghs. I mean, at some points when they were coming back, some of them would just break down, just lay down and start crying, just so utterly bereft of any kind of fortitude afterwards. Just everything they went through. You could die at any moment in France with the Nazis all around you. That just really stuck me about these might be young people, but they have their limits too, and just war and situations like that will easily and very quickly take it all out of you.
Well, yeah, some of the Jedburghs did come back with what we today call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Colby didn't. He came back invigorated. He was ready for his next fight.
Wow.
In fact, these four men, when they returned from World War II, you found none of them stressed out by what they saw and everything. They were all ready for the next fight against communism, just like they'd fought Nazism.
That is amazing. And I honestly have to say, as much as I've read about World War II, until I read this book, I truly did not appreciate how the idea of unconditional surrender, that was the bar right there. You have to totally unconditionally surrender, or there's no negotiations. I did not appreciate how that really affected in a negative way all these different espionage and spying and sabotage going on, because the Germans are like, oh, if you're going to make us completely give up everything, then we are going to fight till the bitter end. Yes, we might lose, but we're going to take as many of you with us and make you pay for it because you're not willing to negotiate. Because if you think about it, almost every other war besides World War II, there would be some kind of you would advance, you would be stopped, you're about to lose, and so you start to negotiate. You get to keep something, but you also get to keep your pride, and that just wasn't going to happen here. And I just did not ever appreciate how that just must have made Donovan's life and his agents just so much harder than it had to be. But could it have been any other way? I mean, you can't let Hitler keep anything of what he's had, because he'll just keep going, and he'll obviously be cruel to all the people that's under the Nazi umbrella.
Yeah, and by way of background, what we're talking about here is at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Roosevelt declared, and Churchill and Stalin went along with it, that the Allies would accept nothing short of unconditional surrender by the Axis powers. Donovan, and actually more so Dulles than Donovan, Dulles thought this was a terrible idea. He went along with it, but he peppered Washington with a lot of memos saying that this would only harden the Germans and the German population to fight to the bitter end, and would be a propaganda advantage for the Nazi regime. And in fact, it was Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, used the unconditional surrender demand to show that, to bolster German morale. It affected Dulles in negotiations he had, or people who approached him, with peace feelers for a German surrender, because he could not cross over that line. The only thing he could say to them was that Germany had to agree to surrender unconditionally. Well, practically all the peace feelers Dulles got from the Germans, whether it was Valkyrie, Himmler, or whatever, they all came with conditions. And they went nowhere within the U.S. government. So it was and it was something that Roosevelt did not stray from. He remained hard line on it, that it would have to be unconditional surrender from the Axis powers.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to describe the Valkyrie. I mean, some of us have seen the movie, we know the broad strokes, but the gentleman that carried that out, I mean, like you were just saying, he literally wanted to, well, what we have is not bad. Let us get rid of Hitler. We'll give back some territory, but let us pretty much keep what we have. I mean, that just couldn't have been tolerated. Having said that, he did, I think come closer than anybody else to actually getting rid of Hitler. But if you could give us that, I mean, it was the way you told it in the book. It was just so amazing. They just knew they had succeeded. They had plans. They had the replacement army all set to go, and just simply moving a briefcase from one side of a thick wooden leg of a table to the other just changed pretty much and just ruined all of that planning and all the time they had taken.
Yeah, the spearhead, the person who became the spearhead behind the Valkyrie plot, who Tom Cruise played in the movie, was Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, who was the man who placed the bomb in the bunker, the Wolf's Lair military compound in Prussia.
Right.
The German dissidents, their plan, which was somewhat breathtaking in terms of what they wanted the United States to help with, was they proposed that they would get the German army on the Western Front that faced the Americans and British and French allies to let the Americans in so that the Germans could move their forces to the Eastern Front to block the advance of the Russians. Now, it was never clear to Donovan or anybody else in Washington how these dissidents were going to move all these armies and everything. Right. But the fact of the matter was Roosevelt was not going to sell out the Russians at that point, and neither was Churchill. And neither was Donovan, too. And even Dulles recognized that kind of a proposal was a non-starter. Yeah. So eventually the Valkyrie plotters decided to go it on their own. Now, where they got the code name Valkyrie was actually the code name for a secret German plan to have its reserve army in Germany mobilize to protect the Nazi government in case there was a coup attempt against it, or in case Allied saboteurs tried to overthrow the government. Well, Stauffenberg could use this plan to call out these forces, not to protect the Nazis, but to overthrow them, and that's what he attempted to do. Yeah. The Valkyrie plot, unfortunately, suffered from a lot of mishaps and miscues. The biggest one was that Hitler wasn't killed in the blast at Wolf's Lair, and the Valkyrie plotters did not have a plan B in mind if Hitler survived that blast. They assumed he would, and Stauffenberg radioed back to the plotters back in Berlin that he had died, and they continued with the plot to roll it out. But once Hitler got on the radio, once he and Goebbels and the other ones reassumed control of the Nazi police and security services, the Valkyrie plotters were very quickly crushed that day. And the Gestapo, which had actually done a lousy job of monitoring the Valkyrie plotters, it was completely surprised by it, was tremendously efficient in rooting out and killing not only the men and women involved in the Valkyrie plot, but several thousand other dissidents that they had on their list that they wanted to get rid of.
Wow. Yeah, and you made a very detailed impression in the book, is tightly wrapped down that Germany is with the Nazis in charge. I mean, like you said, they even go the extra mile, and now security is super tight because of this assassination attempt. And now at this point is the point where Donovan wants to actually get spies inside Germany, when it's going to become even harder because this did not succeed. And please feel free to talk about that. But I just have to ask, and I think we've semi-answered this question in some ways, between all the spying, the counter-spying, the confusion, the resistance, and everybody's got their own agenda, you just kind of wonder how the Allies were surprised by the Battle of the Bulge, or what became known as the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, this was the Ardennes offensive that began December 16, 1944, and lasted until about January 25th. This was a surprise, last-gasp offensive. I think Hitler codenamed it Autumn Mist, to attack the Allied armies. Hitler's plan, the Ardennes offensive, quickly failed, and we won the Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
But what it did was highlight for the American leadership how little intelligence it had on the Germans at the front, or even further away from the front. So Donovan's OSS was caught flat-footed on it, and also military intelligence for the different Allied armies were caught flat-footed on it too. So it made it more imperative to Allied military leaders to know more about what was going on with the Germans beyond the front lines, what the movements were. And so that was why there was a new momentum, blowing wind at the sails of Casey's organization to get those agents deep into German territory to radio back intelligence on what the Germans were up to. So there wouldn't be another surprise like the Battle of the Bulge. And in fact, the senior commanders of the different Allied commands, or the different Allied armies, told Casey and his superiors that don't be cautious here. We're losing 2,000 men a day. Yeah. Don't be worried about a few agents being sacrificed here. Get us anything you can, which is what Casey did, with very mixed results.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say that if you're a general far away, but if these are your men, you're training them or you're responsible, it's not as easy just to send them in going, yeah, there's a good chance you could die, because these guys are professionals. They do want to prepare their agents and give them the greatest chance to survive. So they're able to get some men and women in. They're able to get some information, and during all of this, and especially after the Valkyrie, I mean, Stalin is his normal paranoid self. Anything the Americans do, any kind of communications, any kind of negotiations with any German authorities, you've got to think Stalin's going, oh, you're going to create a separate peace. You're going to free up all the Germans on the western side. They're going to be able to come over to the Eastern Front and stall us, and then you're all going to be able to come in. And they had to be careful because the Russians were literally kicking the crap out of the Germans. I mean, they deserve a lot of credit, and there's a lot of forces there. You don't want to make Stalin upset, because it's nothing more than a marriage of convenience that could easily fall apart. And I think some of the Germans were angling for that.
Well, Stalin was always paranoid that the Allies would sell him out. And ironically, the Allies were paranoid that Stalin would sell them out too. So, I mean, among the major powers, nobody really trusted anyone. I mean, this was an alliance of convenience in many respects. And, throughout this part of the war, Stalin also was very, very nervous that the Allies seemed to be making a very, very quick advance through Germany while he was still slogging away on the Eastern Front. Everybody at that point was racing to get to Berlin.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, maybe, were the Germans making it easier for the Americans? I mean, that's some of the thoughts that's probably going on in his head. And I love the part of the book where, I think it's October of 1944, Dulles is starting to get some of the idea of resistance, or whatever word you would like to use, with the Russians. I mean, and not that he deserves single credit for this, but does Dulles predict the coming Cold War? But that's probably not a yes or no, but he does get the sense that he can't trust the Russians. They're not truly, absolutely on their side. They're on their own side. Not that you can blame them for that, but he does really get the sense that there's going to be something coming after Germany is defeated.
Yes, I mean, Dulles predicted a future Cold War with the Russians. So did Donovan. So did actually a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And Donovan had a complicated relationship with the Russians. He did some intelligence sharing with them, some sharing of equipment and documents and everything. But he tried to set up a spy station in Russia to spy on the Germans. And, of course, the Russians had an active espionage program here in the United States, spying on the Americans, too. And even, as the war neared the end and the Allies moved into Berlin, war-torn Berlin, the American mission soon changed from spying on the remnants of Nazi Germany to spying on the Russians in their zone on what they were up to, because the Russians had infiltrated all kinds of agents and snitches and spies into the western zones that the British and the French and the Americans occupied. Also, under highly classified orders that Donovan gave to Allen Dulles and Richard Helms, who went in to set up a station in Berlin, Helms and the other officers there were not only spying on the Russians, they were also spying on the British and French, too. Donovan assumed that the British and the French would spy on the Americans, so he was going to collect intelligence on them. I mean, this happens, and, this isn't anything, it should be expected. I mean, we still have, even today, all the furor raised over German Chancellor Angela Merkel's phone being tapped by the National Security Agency, her cell phone. Right. Well, it's happened for a long time. I mean, spying, after all, is the world's second oldest profession, and we spy on our allies very often as much as we do on our enemies.
Yeah, you do it. You're just not supposed to talk about it or get caught.
Well, yeah, and the British throughout World War II monitored very closely Donovan's activities, where he went, what he did. I spent a number of weeks in the National Archives in London going through the Special Operations Executive records and some of the few intelligence records that are declassified there. And they watched Donovan as closely as they did Hitler.
But I can't remember if it was Valkyrie or the Battle of the Bulge, but the British, and I apologize, I can't remember, but the British knew some of what was coming, and they didn't share with the Americans. And you finally get the sense, and maybe this is just naive on my part, but you get the sense that, each side was spying on each other. They weren't sharing unless they absolutely had to, and everybody's just watching everybody else because they know this war is going to be over with one day, and you've got to think about the day after the war, and you've got to set yourself up and your country up for the best possible position for all those tomorrows after Germany is defeated.
Well, it's true. I mean, this was actually in the Valkyrie plot. Dulles ordered that his dealings with the German dissident movement, which he codenamed Breakers, that the British be looped out of it, that they not be kept apprised of it. After the failed Valkyrie plot, Dulles approved American representatives going to the British to tell them that, yes, we've been hearing about this. Dulles had been receiving information on this. The British actually weren't particularly outraged over this news or anything, mainly because they'd been keeping track of the Valkyrie plot, too, and had been telling Dulles what they knew.
You can't trust anybody. That's just sad. So everybody's getting closer to Berlin. Everybody's starting to spy on everybody. Everybody's looking for underground Nazis. And you've also got Operation Paperclip, I believe it's called, where everybody's going after scientists as far as the rockets, the technology with the rockets. And again, it's already started. Everybody's grabbing up everybody else. But I was a little, and maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was a little surprised about the Russians on their side. And maybe you can't blame them because they've already lost 20 million people. But they were pretty rough with the Allied spies that they caught in and around Berlin. Everybody's trying to gather information, and you can't blame them. But the Russians were playing for keeps.
Well, they were. They did play hardball. When Dulles and Helms went in, their immediate mission was, investigating Nazi war crimes, rounding up war criminals. Operation Paperclip that you mentioned, which was gathering up German scientists to ship them back to the United States. They were hunting for art artworks the Nazis had looted. Helms's people even managed to track down the nurse who had been in Hitler's Führer bunker near the Reich Chancellery, and who was able to detail for them Hitler's final days before his suicide. But the Russians played pretty rough with some of the American informants and agents that they encountered in their zones. We played pretty rough with the Russians too. There were a number of Russian agents who were acting out that got beaten up and tossed back into their own zone by the Americans. So they all actually started out fairly accommodating to one another in the beginning, but soon the lines were drawn between the different sectors and the zones throughout Germany, and the Cold War then really started.
Right. Could you tell me a little bit about Sunrise? I was reading about Sunrise and thinking, okay, it's over. And then you would go to something else and you come back, okay, now Sunrise is over. And then you would go away. I was like, oh my God, this could be a book all in itself about trying to get the Germans to surrender unconditionally. They didn't know who to negotiate with and who they could trust and who had the authority. I mean, that just must have drove everybody, including the Germans, crazy. And during all of this, you got Stalin watching everything that's going on.
Sunrise was the code name for a highly secret diplomatic operation that Dulles was involved in to negotiate the surrender of German forces in northern Italy. Mm-hmm. The British code named the operation Crossword because Churchill thought it was a puzzle that would never be unraveled. And the negotiations went on and off for several months. And eventually the Russians, who actually were getting intelligence on what what Dulles was up to, mm-hmm. Stalin complained to Roosevelt that the Russians wanted in on the negotiations and wanted to be there negotiating with the Germans that were surrendering in northern Italy. And Roosevelt refused. His view was that the Americans wouldn't be involved in Russian surrender negotiations with Germans on the Eastern Front. They weren't going to bring the Russians in on these negotiations. Stalin was paranoid that the Allies were going to negotiate an end to the war in northern Italy and allow those German forces to reinforce the Eastern Front against him. And there was an angry exchange of letters between Stalin and Roosevelt over the Sunrise negotiations. In fact, among the most angry diplomatic exchanges the two leaders ever had during the war. The whole secret dealings to get this German surrenders became incredibly complicated, mm-hmm. and dragged on and on until Dulles managed to effect a final surrender of the German forces only in northern Italy, only several days before the entire German army surrendered on May 8th, 1945. And it ended up that the early surrender of the German forces in northern Italy probably saved more German lives than it did American Allied lives there, because the Americans were winning and the Germans were losing on that front as it was.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the sales pitch. Look, we're trying to save your men too, because we will go through all of your men to get to northern Italy. So, and you're not going to win. So, but again, when you have unconditional surrender and everything's so complicated and nobody wants to lose, I mean, yeah, I can see why it was just strung out for such a long time. And before the war ends, FDR dies. You know, he's the one who got this entire thing going with Donovan. Was Donovan concerned for his creation, if you will, once FDR is gone and he's replaced by Truman?
Concerned is too mild an adjective. Donovan was deeply worried when Roosevelt died, because Roosevelt had protected him against Donovan's bureaucratic enemies in Washington, which were many. Donovan and Harry Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, were not close. There was just bad karma between these two guys. I mean, on the one hand, you had a successful Wall Street Republican lawyer in Donovan. On the other hand, you had a failed Missouri haberdasher who was a diehard Democrat in Truman. What's more, other bureaucratic enemies soon began to gang up on Donovan. J. Edgar Hoover, who was director of the FBI, was a bitter enemy of Donovan's. Hoover managed to have an agent place a particularly nasty rumor with Truman's senior military aide, which got to Truman, that Donovan was having an illicit affair with Donovan's own daughter-in-law. They played pretty hardball back then. Now, I had to investigate this rumor, and I discovered I found no truth to it. But as I mentioned, Donovan had had a number of affairs over the years, and it was common knowledge. That wasn't really what did Donovan in with Harry Truman. The Army military intelligence had formed a very secret organization behind Donovan's back, a foreign intelligence espionage outfit behind his back, nicknamed the Pond, which not only spied on the Axis behind Donovan's back, it spied on Donovan, it spied on his OSS officers. The Pond even collected information on the wives of OSS officers.
Wow.
This secretive unit managed to get a lengthy report to Truman's desk accusing Donovan's organization of all manner of failed operations, malfeasance, criminal activity, whatever. It even accused Donovan's agents of staging a sex orgy in India, which, again, I could find no evidence that was the case. But that was enough for Truman. So he shut down the OSS at the end of September, parceled out its functions to the Pentagon and to the State Department.
Wow. So, I mean, first of all, only in America can you go from not being able to run a haberdashery to President of the United States. I mean, that's got to be a story in and of itself. But anyway, so people like Colby are men of action. They like you said, they weren't fatigued at the end of this. So he gets bored and he resigns. And so what does Colby do immediately after the war?
Well, and going back just briefly to Truman, Truman wasn't deaf and dumb to the threat he faced overseas, particularly with the onset of the Cold War. He knew he needed a foreign intelligence service. He just didn't want Donovan or his OSS to be any part of it.
Yeah.
In 1947, Truman formed the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which, interestingly enough, was modeled after the vision Donovan had for the post-war Central Intelligence Agency. In that interim, though, from the end of the war in 1945 to 1947, it was kind of a stormy period for U.S. intelligence, and it was more or less adrift. Allen Dulles eventually left occupied Berlin on October 10th, 1945, just after the OSS was closed down.
Right.
Richard Helms left Berlin in December 11th, 1945. Both of them were kind of bored with what they were doing, wanted to do something else. Bill Colby went to law school, got a law degree, but soon was bored practicing labor law, and he went back to the CIA. Richard Helms decided, he wanted to be a newspaper publisher before the war, but he decided being a spy was a lot more fun, and he joined the interim intelligence units and then eventually became a senior officer in the CIA. Allen Dulles went back to his international law firm in New York and quickly grew bored with that and eventually became deputy director of the CIA, and then after that, CIA director. Bill Casey came home and to earn his fortune in New York, but then he wanted to go back into national security work, and he ended up as Ronald Reagan's CIA director from 1981 to 87.
Well, yeah, and the one thing that just made a huge impression on me was most of these men either had money or came from money or were able to get money, but they were just bored, and so they went into this. Maybe they wanted to have some adventure, or they wanted to help their country, or that, yes, Hitlerism is bad, but you just get the sense that these guys were just doers. They were intelligent, and they just needed a challenge, something on their level to challenge them. So having money is nice, but that's just a tool at the end of the day. They needed to be challenged, whether it's physical danger or political danger or whatever, but you just get the sense that these guys were just looking for the next big challenge in their life. I think you said in your book, they never looked back to the past. It was always like, what's going on today or what's going to happen tomorrow. They were just looking for the next big thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in the case of like Bill Casey, the reason he went back to earn his fortune in New York was he wanted to do it like Donovan did, make enough money so he could go into Washington and walk away from anything he didn't want to do. But he wanted to dabble in national security affairs and become heavily involved in it, just as Donovan did. And that's what he ended up doing.
Yeah, and I like, and I'm going to change the wording, but basically he wanted your screw you money so he could say that to anybody and not be hurt, because when you have money, you can retreat into your money and you're going to be okay. So again, it was just an amazing experience to go through this book. If we could, and maybe I'm anticipating another book that might be coming from this one, but could you just give us an idea of, and this really stayed with me. These are men of action, and yes, they're intelligent, but they're doers. And then suddenly, in their own time, they become in charge of the CIA. And being out in the field and risking your life and matching wits with other spies is one thing. Running a spy organization as large as the CIA becomes is a totally different animal with a different skill set. And it didn't always work out for them.
Well, it didn't, and they all four of them met with sad endings. Allen Dulles, who was America's spy chief from 1953 to 61, launched the calamitous operation to land CIA-trained anti-Castro guerrillas at Cuba's Bay of Pigs. Mm-hmm. Richard Helms, who was CIA director from 1966 to 73, was convicted of lying to Congress about the CIA's effort to oust President Salvador Allende in Chile. Mm. Bill Colby, who was CIA director from 1973 to 76, would become a pariah among Langley's old hands for releasing to Congress what became known as the Family Jewels Report on the agency's misdeeds during the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. Wow. And Bill Casey, who was Ronald Reagan's CIA director from 1981 to 87, mm-hmm. would nearly bring down the agency and Reagan's presidency from a scheme that secretly supplied Nicaragua's Contras with money raked off from the sale of arms to Iran for American hostages in Beirut. This was the Iran-Contra scandal. Mm. So as I said, I think toward the end of the book, this was a sad ending for all four of these men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess there's a certain amount of wisdom in knowing to say enough is enough or to be able to walk away. But I think they just lived off that high and they just kept going and going and going. And like I said, it's a different skill set to actually run the whole thing. So again, it was just an amazing read. I enjoyed it really so much. But I would like to end on two weird small points, if I may. FDR collected stamps. And I think I read something in your book about, was there a stamp either with Himmler's picture or put out by Hitler that the OSS made sure that FDR got a copy of that stamp?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, Donovan routinely had his agents overseas collect stamps that they could send back to the philatelist in chief because Donovan knew that Roosevelt was a stamp collector. So he sent them to him to butter him up. And there was a Himmler stamp that was kind of mysterious that nobody knew how it ever got on the German market that Donovan sent to Roosevelt.
Yeah, I mean, it never hurts to butter up the boss, and if you find out he's into stamps, let's give this man some stamps. And the last one, and I can't remember where this is at in the timeline, I apologize, and it might have only been a discussion, it might have only been a theory, but I think I read something, and this might have been in the Wild Bill Donovan book, something about trying to slip Hitler some estrogen or some female hormones.
That That was a psychological operation.
Right.
Just by way of background, Donovan hired a guy named Stanley Lovell, who was a very famous New England inventor. And he was the guy who constructed all the gadgets for Donovan's OSS officers and spies. You know, things like lumps of coal that could explode, or pencil-like explosive devices for discrete assassination jobs, or truth drugs and this and that. One of the things Lovell's team concocted was a set of female hormones, and if they could find Hitler's vegetables, and I'm not making this up, but if they could find Hitler's vegetables and inject them with these hormones, that it would make the Fuhrer's mustache fall off and give him a falsetto voice, which would be a real bummer for the dictator.
Yeah, I just couldn't fear him after the mustache, falls off, and he's like, "Oh, Hitler." Yeah, it just wouldn't work for me. So that might have ended the war right there.
Yeah, but unfortunately, they never found Hitler's vegetables to do all this. But they tried. I mean, they were. I mean, just for one fine. I mean, that wasn't the only wacky idea they planned. Actually, even some of them Roosevelt sent to Donovan.
Right.
One of them was someone had come to Eleanor with the idea that you could fit bats, bats that, hover in the eaves of houses at night and everything, strap on incendiary devices on them, and you would take a plane over Japan, drop the bats out of the plane. They would fly into the eaves of the wood and paper homes of Japan. Their incendiary devices would go off and burn down Japan.
That sounds like a very plausible plan to me.
Well, actually, Roosevelt thought it was an interesting idea, and he passed it on from Eleanor to Donovan. So some of Donovan's men got these bunch of bats and took them out to somewhere, I think it was in the west and Midwest, loaded them on a plane, dropped them out of the plane. Well, guess what happened to the bats? They all sank like stones. No way that idea was going to work, but gave it a try.
See, fiction does not stand a chance against fact and history. You just can't make that stuff up. That's too amazing. Well, Mr. Waller, I really do appreciate it. And again, I absolutely loved your book. It was an absolute page turner. It just made my week go by. And again, I just want to thank you for your time.
Well, it's good talking to you.
Yeah, so everybody please check out whether you get, like I did, the digital copy or the paper copy or the Audible copy. It is Disciples, the World War II missions of the CIA directors who fought for Wild Bill Donovan. Mr. Waller, thank you very much, and I hope you have a pleasant evening.